The trial of the police officer accused of killing George Floyd began this week. And the first few days were filled with testimony from the witnesses, from the neighbor, the store clerk, the firefighter, the mixed martial artist, the teenager who was going to the store to get snacks and a new cell phone charger. And all of them talked about how helpless they felt, seeing the police officer's knee pinning George Floyd's neck down for 9 minutes. Many of them cried as they talked about hearing Floyd say, "I can't breathe." And hearing these witnesses' testimony, I feel like has given me some insight into what it must have been like for those who witnessed Jesus' crucifixion. That feeling of wanting to do something but not knowing what to do. That knowledge that if you do try to physically intervene, you could also become a victim of state violence. The after effects of laying awake at night wondering, what should I have done? And yet, even as helpless as they felt, as guilty as some of the witnesses of Floyd's murder feel, they were not passive. The firefighter told the police officers to check Floyd's pulse. And the mixed martial artist called the police on the police. And the teenager getting snacks and a phone charger, she turned on her cell phone and started recording, providing valuable documentation of what had happened. To be a witness is no small thing. And I don't think that we give Mary and Joanna and Mary and the other women enough credit for their functioning in the face of death. At the supposed end of Jesus' life, in the wake of violence, in the depths of their grief, they bear witness and they tend to the dead. You might have noticed that the 12 guys are nowhere to be found here right after the crucifixion. Judas has betrayed Jesus. Peter has denied Jesus. Matthew and James and John, maybe they were part of the acquaintances that Luke mentions who are watching the crucifixion from a distance. But they've disappeared. It's Joseph of Arimathea, who is a council member, who goes to Pilate, asks for the body, takes Jesus' body off of the cross, wraps it in linen, carries it to his family tomb. These are physically intimate and demanding tasks that Joseph does. And it's the women who, despite the trauma of having just seen someone they love be brutally murdered, they are thinking ahead to the spices and the ointments. They somehow realize that if they're going to tend to the body, they'll need to know where the body is put. And so they stumble through the growing dark after Joseph to see where Jesus' body is laid. The women do observe the Sabbath, but then they're back as soon as they can go back. In the early morning, some translations say in the deep dawn, they go back to the tomb with their spices and with their ointments to tend to the dead, except instead of a body, they find an empty tomb, and these two men in glowing robes show up, and they ask this question, right? Why do you look for the living among the dead? And I know it's supposed to be a rhetorical question, but there's an answer. The women aren't looking for the living. They're looking for the dead among the dead, which is a very reasonable thing for them to be doing, considering the circumstances. Tending to the dead is their good deed. It's considered a very important good deed in the Jewish tradition because you can't be repaid for it. People who have died can't pay you back for your kindness. So they are doing their loving and faithful duty. Do you feel some affinity with these women? Bleary-eyed and tired, trying to be faithful, traumatized by death, and yet still seeking to do something. Trying somehow to tend to their dead. And we have so many dead to tend to these days. We have victims of police violence, like George Floyd. We have victims of anti-trans, anti-Asian, other types of hate crimes. We have way too many victims of gun violence, with 3 public mass shootings in the last 2.5 weeks. And of course, we have the over 2,800,000 people who have died of COVID. Like the women, we are traumatized. It is too much. We're weary and we feel helpless, and yet we want to do something. We're working for reforms in the criminal legal system, and we're speaking out against prejudice and bigotry and hatred. We're working to end gun violence. We're wearing our masks and getting our shots and volunteering at the vaccine clinics. We're delivering meals and sending cards. We're struggling to be kind and generous even when we feel really grumpy and exhausted. We are stumbling through the darkness of deep dawn, trying to tend to the dead and the grieving in the best ways that we know how. Some preachers this morning will talk about the women's lack of faith because they thought Jesus was still dead and they were terrified by the empty tomb. But I say that the faith of these women is the truest and the fiercest kind of faith there is. To look for the dead among the dead, to be willing to tend to them, despite weariness and discomfort and even danger. To bear witness to death and to the powers that enact it, even when those powers want to keep it quiet, want to keep you quiet. My friend Dana Olsen-Getty compares these women to Mamie Till, who insisted on an open casket for her son, Emmett, so that the world could see his brutalized body, a 14-year-old black boy lynched by white men. Dana compares these women to Leslie McSpadden, who wept over the body of her son, Michael Brown, in the streets of Ferguson. There is nothing easy or passive or cowardly about tending to our dead. It takes great faith and compassion and courage to go to the tomb with our spices and our ointments, to be willing to unwrap and lay hands on the beloved body. This is the faith that God honors on Easter morning. This is the faith that allows the women to receive the angel's proclamation. Jesus is not here. He has risen. This is the faith that makes the women the apostles to the apostles, that makes them the first preachers of the gospel, the human source of the divine good news of resurrection. Luke writes that returning from the tomb, the women told all this to the 11 and all the rest. Told all this, and oh, how I wish that Luke had given us the words of that first Easter sermon, had told us what all this was. But I imagine that all this includes the sealed tomb and the empty tomb, the fear and the courage, the confusion and the clarity, the tending to the dead and the resurrection life. I assume it includes all of that, because if they only told the good parts, if it was only the empty tomb and the clarity and the courage, no one would understand the power of the experience. I imagine that they told all of this because you need an intimate understanding of death before you can truly appreciate and celebrate the resurrection life. Like that other Joanna so many years ago, I also want to tell all of this, that the power and love and life of God has defeated death itself in some profound and incomprehensible way that is beyond us, and yet that holds us tightly and tenderly always. And that the power and love and life of God has also defeated human collaborators with death. The resurrection life made known that first Easter morning challenges and subverts all power that would rely on fear and violence. It demands truth in the face of lies, and it gives courage to those that the system would intimidate and terrify. And this overcoming of earthly collaborators with death, this is also profound. But it is not incomprehensible. It is not beyond us. In fact, the astonishing part of the Easter story is that we are invited to be part of the overcoming. As we are faithful in tending to our dead, we are also called to be faithful to tending to the resurrection life that God breathes into the world. These two things go together. Those of us willing to bear witness to the death and the violence and the grief of God's beloveds, those of us stumbling through the deep dawn to tend to the dead and the grieving, we will find ourselves in the very best position to receive, to soak in the good news of Easter morning, that Jesus Christ is risen. He has risen indeed. Thanks be to God.